Nick Pope, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Now, you were part of this effort to track UFO sightings, and I know 90% of the time it was due to factors like weather or an airplane or satellites. But give us some examples of the kind of reports that you were looking into that were unexplained.
Well, the cases that were most interesting to us at the Ministry of Defence were the sorts of cases where UFOs were seen by police officers or pilots, and indeed where they were tracked on radar. Now, a good example is a case from 1993 where I led the investigation, and a UFO flew directly over 2 Air Force bases in England, and a report on that went up to the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, one of Britain's most senior military officers.
And now that report, that wouldn't have been the Aurora spy plane, would it?
Well, now that was interesting because we were in the middle of a controversy about whether secret prototype aircraft were operating over the United Kingdom or not. And there was a lot of conversation between the embassies on this issue. And spy planes was one of the theories that was doing the rounds. But frankly, we got assurances and gave assurances in our parliament that this wasn't the case. And I think a lot of people were saying spy planes simply because they didn't know what else to think. I mean, here we had huge triangular-shaped craft just flying over large parts of the country with total impunity.
So what do you think it was?
Well, we don't know to this day, and the case file on this incident is one of the files that's been opened to the public. And there's a marvelous quote in it where my head of division briefs these senior military officers and says, in summary, there is some evidence to suggest that an unidentified object or objects flew over the United Kingdom on the night in question. And frankly, we didn't know what else to say. We'd eliminated all the conventional explanations and we were left with a complete mystery.
One of Britain's most famous UFO sightings, called the Rendlesham Forest incident, was actually reported by an American Air Force commander who was stationed there. Explain to us what he reported.
Well, this was Britain's most compelling UFO case, and actually on the first night it was claimed that a UFO had actually landed, and some of the United States Air Force personnel who were based in England at these Air Force bases got close enough to touch this thing, to see strange markings on the side that they likened to Egyptian hieroglyphs. Our defense intelligence staff assessed radiation levels taken at the landing site as significantly higher than background, and that's a direct quote from the government's own assessment. The witnesses included the deputy base commander, and he saw this thing fire light beams down at the ground. Now, in the newly released files, a former chief of the defence staff here in Britain writes to our Secretary of State for Defence and says that the Ministry of Defence's position on this is totally untenable.
So what do you mean by that, totally untenable? I mean, what was he trying to say?
Well, the Ministry of Defence here has this rather neat soundbite. When we can't explain UFOs, we say that they're unexplained, but that as long as there's no evidence of a threat, they are judged to be of no defence significance. But Lord Hill Norton said, as a former chief of the defence staff, he said, look, that phrase, no defence significance, is meaningless, he said, because either this happened, as the witnesses claimed, and a UFO landed next to 2 of NATO's most important military bases at a time of huge international crisis, or, he said, all these American Air Force personnel were hallucinating or making it up. And he said in either event, he said this must be of defense interest.
And I know these files also point out that the years with the most sightings were also years where science fiction was really in the public imagination, be it the X-Files, the movies, Independence Day, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The years that those movies came out were big years where lots of things were being reported. Do you think people were really being influenced by movies?
There is some sort of a relationship. I mean, maybe it makes people who've had a sighting more inclined to make a report. But really, one can point to other years where there were big blockbuster movies with UFO and alien themes, like E.T., or like the remake of The War of the Worlds. And there is no spike in the figures in those years. So I think that's a little bit wide of the mark, to be honest.
And Nick, you didn't start off as a UFO researcher per se. In fact, you were a skeptic about all this. What was it that made you a believer?
Well, I was a career government man. I served for 21 years in the Ministry of Defense. I certainly had no belief or no interest in UFOs. But the more I looked at these files, going back to the 50s, and the Ministry of Defense has received 12,000 UFO reports from that time to the present day. I looked into those files, I investigated the cases that happened on my tour of duty, and I began to think that while most of them could be easily explained, there were these small number, the 5% or so, where it did seem we had strong evidence that structured craft were performing speeds and maneuvers that we couldn't match. Did any of us think they were extraterrestrial? Well, you know, no, we weren't paid up believers in little green men, but we didn't have an explanation either. So we just thought that there were some interesting defense and national security issues here.
All right, Nick Pope with his perspective joining us tonight. Nick, thanks so much for your time.